2 months from now, Grace Hartley would stand before the entire town and confess something that could destroy her forever. But tonight, a stranger appeared at the ranch with words that turned her blood to ice. Richard knows where you are, and he is coming. The monster she had escaped had found her, and this time there was nowhere left to run. This is her story. 2 months from now, she would stand before the entire town of Mason Creek and confess something that could destroy her forever. But right now, in the bone-cutting cold of this November afternoon, Grace Hartley knew only one thing: the man she had come to marry was dead, and there was no way back. The wind sliced through her thin coat like a blade. Her fingers had gone numb an hour ago, the tips blue beneath the worn cotton gloves. She could smell wood smoke from the chimney of the small cabin before her, that ancient promise of warmth and human life. But not the life she had expected, not the life she had traveled 2,000 miles to find. Pastor Thomas Weller opened the door, and Grace knew from his face before he spoke a single word. It was the look men wore when they carried news that would break something inside you. A look she had seen before, though never directed at her, with such gentle, hopeless pity. "You must be Miss Hartley," he said. His voice was soft, apologetic. "Please come inside." She stepped into the warmth. The cabin was small, neat, smelling of coffee and old wood. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. On the mantel sat a photograph of a man she recognized from the letter he had sent, though the image had faded with age and handling. James Crawford, her intended husband, a rancher looking for a wife to help him through the coming winter, to build a life with on the Wyoming plains. "I am very sorry to have to tell you this," Pastor Weller said, gesturing for her to sit. She remained standing. If she sat, her legs might never find the strength to rise again. "James passed 2 weeks ago. A sudden heart failure while working his cattle. He went quickly, without pain." The words landed like stones in still water, each one creating ripples that spread and overlapped until Grace could not tell which came first, which mattered most. Dead. 2 weeks. No pain. As if that last detail could soften the others. She had no words. What could she say? That she had spent every penny she had saved in secret over 3 years to buy the train ticket west. That she had burned the only bridge behind her, and there was no returning across that charred span. That she was not here out of love, or even the promise of love, but out of pure animal desperation to escape. "Do you have family back east?" the pastor asked. "Someone we can wire, someone who can send for you?" Grace shook her head slowly. The movement felt distant, as if someone else controlled her body, and she merely watched from behind her own eyes. "I see," Pastor Weller's face creased with concern. "Forgive me for asking, but do you have the means to return?" "No." The word came out smaller than she intended. A whisper, a confession. "Then we have a problem," he said quietly. Through the window, Grace could see snow beginning to fall. Fat, lazy flakes that would accumulate and bury and silence everything beneath their white weight. Winter was coming to Wyoming. She could feel it in the air, taste it like iron on her tongue. And she had nowhere to go. 6 weeks earlier, in a different world that seemed now like something from a half-remembered dream, Grace had stood before a mirror in a Boston townhouse and examined the bruises on her wrist. They were yellow-green at the edges, fading but still visible. She pulled her sleeve down, carefully smoothed the fabric. From downstairs came the sound of Richard's voice, raised in anger at one of the servants. Some small infraction, a dish placed on the wrong side of the table, a coat not brushed properly. It did not matter what the offense was. Richard Hartley always found something. Grace had learned in the 4 years since their wedding that there were two versions of her husband. The public Richard, charming and cultured, a successful merchant with impeccable manners and a generous smile. And the private Richard, the one who emerged behind closed doors, whose hands left marks that had to be hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars. "You are mine," he had told her the night before, his fingers tight around her throat, not quite choking but threatening. "Forever. No one else would want you. You are nothing without me." She had believed him once, had believed that the fault lay in her, that if she could only be better, quieter, more obedient, the bruises would stop appearing. But time had taught her what shame and fear had initially hidden. Richard did not hurt her because she failed. He hurt her because he could, because she was his legal property under the law, his wife before God, and no one would intervene. She had tried to leave twice before. The first time she made it as far as her sister's home in Connecticut, Richard found her within a week, apologized to her sister with tears in his eyes, explained that his wife was unwell, confused. Grace had seen the warning in his eyes and gone with him quietly. The beating that followed had been methodical, careful, nothing where it would show. The second time, she had tried to board a ship to England. Richard's men caught her at the dock. That time he broke her arm, told the doctor she had fallen down the stairs. The doctor had looked at her with knowing eyes but said nothing. What could he say? She was a wife. Her husband had rights. But Richard had made a mistake. In his rage and his need to teach her a lesson, he had gotten careless. One of the servants, a young man named Thomas, had tried to intervene when he heard Grace screaming. Richard had struck him. Hard. The young man had hit his head on the corner of a marble table and died 3 days later. Richard's money had covered it up. An accident. A tragic fall. The boy's family, poor Irish immigrants, had no voice, no power to demand justice. But Grace had watched it happen, had seen the light go out in Thomas's eyes, had understood finally that Richard would kill her too. Perhaps not today, perhaps not next month, but eventually in some moment of rage he would go too far, and there would be no one to mourn her. That was when she found the advertisement in the back of a newspaper. Mail-order brides wanted for the Western Territories. Men seeking wives, women seeking new lives. It was a transaction clean and simple, and it was a door to disappear through. She had chosen James Crawford because his letter had been kind, because he was old enough that perhaps he would be gentle, too worn down by life to raise his fists, because Wyoming was far enough that Richard might never find her. She had stolen nothing but herself, had taken only the clothes on her back and the few dollars she had hidden away from household money, saved 1 penny and nickel at a time. The sapphire necklace she wore had been a gift from Richard's mother given on their wedding day. She had meant to sell it when she arrived to have something to start her new life. Now it hung around her neck like a noose, evidence that could be used against her if Richard ever found her. When she fled, Richard had been away on business in Philadelphia. By the time he returned and discovered her gone, she was already crossing the Mississippi. But she knew he would search, knew he would hire men to spend whatever money it took. Richard Hartley did not accept loss. He did not allow his possessions to escape. And so Grace Hartley had come west with winter at her heels and the law on her side. The law that said a wife belonged to her husband. The law that gave him rights over her body, her freedom, her very breath. Now she stood in Pastor Weller's cabin, and the last thread of her escape had snapped. James Crawford, the man who was supposed to be her salvation, was in the ground. And she was stranded in a town she did not know, with winter coming, and no way forward, no way back. "Miss Hartley," Pastor Weller said gently, "the town is small. We do not have much in the way of resources, especially not with winter approaching. But we will not turn you out. Perhaps there is a family that needs help. Someone who could take you in, give you work." Grace nodded, though the words felt hollow. She had heard such promises before. Kindness was easy to speak, harder to sustain when it required sacrifice. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the smell of horses and leather. Grace turned to see a man step inside, tall and broad-shouldered, snow, dusting the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his coat. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with a face weathered by sun and wind, eyes the color of winter sky. He nodded to the pastor, then his gaze found Grace. She felt herself tense, an instinct born of too many years reading men's eyes for danger. But this man's look held no threat, only a quiet, assessing curiosity. "Ethan," Pastor Weller said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God, I was about to send someone to find you." The man Ethan removed his hat. Snow melted in his dark hair. "What do you need, Pastor?" "This is Miss Grace Hartley. She came from Boston to marry James Crawford. But James, as you know, passed 2 weeks ago." Ethan's eyes moved to Grace again, and she saw understanding settle there. Not pity exactly. Something else. Something that made her throat tighten. "I see," Ethan said quietly. "Miss Hartley has no family to return to, no means to travel. I was just explaining that the town might find a place for her, some family needing help." Ethan was silent for a long moment. Grace watched him think, saw the calculation behind his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, as if each word cost him something. "The ranch needs a cook," he said. "Winter coming on, we will be short-handed. If Miss Hartley can cook, she has work and a place to stay. Grace felt something shift in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or just the desperate relief of a drowning person offered a hand. I can cook, she heard herself say. Her voice was stronger now. I can work. Ethan nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Then you have a cue. And shelter. Pastor Weller looked between them, surprise and relief warring on his face. Ethan, that is generous of you, but are you certain Cal should be consulted? This is his ranch after all. Cal hired me to manage the place, Ethan said. I am managing. If he has objections, he can voice them. But I do not think he will. He looked at Grace. Get your things. We leave now. Storm is coming. Grace had one small carpet bag with everything she owned. She retrieved it from where she had set it by the door, the weight of it almost nothing in her hand. A few dresses, a change of undergarments, a book of poetry her mother had given her before she died. Not much to show for 29 years of living. Ethan led her outside to a wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. He took her bag without asking, placed it in the back, then offered his hand to help her up. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. His grip was firm, calloused warm through her thin glove. He did not hold on longer than necessary, did not let his fingers linger. The moment she was seated, he released her and climbed up beside her. They rode in silence. The wagon wheels crunched through snow that was already several inches deep and accumulating faster. The wind had teeth-biting, exposed skin searching for gaps in clothing. Grace pulled her coat tighter, knowing it would do little good. The cold out here was different from Boston's cold. Bigger, more indifferent. Around them, the landscape stretched white and endless. Rolling plains broken by occasional stands of cottonwood trees, their bare branches black against the pale sky. In the distance, mountains rose like the bones of the earth pushing through skin. The world felt enormous out here. Empty, as if a person could scream and the sound would simply dissipate into all that space, never reaching another human ear. Grace studied the man beside her from the corner of her eye. Ethan sat straight, hands steady on the reins, his profile hard and still. He did not speak, did not ask questions, did not pry into who she was or why she had come. There was something almost restful in his silence, a quality that allowed her to simply exist without explanation or defense. But she also felt the weight of unasked questions. Why would a man offer work and shelter to a strange woman without hesitation? What did he want? What would be the price of this kindness? 4 years with Richard had taught her that nothing came without cost. Every gift was a chain. Every kindness a debt to be called due. As if sensing her thoughts, Ethan spoke without looking at her. You will have your own room, small but private. You will cook for me, for Cal Northridge, who owns the ranch, and for any hands we have on at the time. Mostly just the three of us through winter. You will be paid fair wages. What you do with that money is your business. Grace swallowed. Thank you. No need for thanks. It is work. You earn your keep. Another mile passed in silence. Then Ethan reached to his neck and unwound the scarf. He wore, a thick knitted thing in dark blue wool. He held it out to her. You are shaking, he said simply. Grace looked at the scarf, then at him. I cannot take your scarf. Already have another in my coat. Take it. She took it. The wool was warm from his body heat, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something clean she could not name. She wrapped it around her neck and felt the shaking ease just slightly. This small act of care, offered without ceremony or expectation of gratitude, felt strange, foreign. She did not know what to do with it. The ranch appeared as the sun began to set, the sky turning colors that had no names. Deep purples and violent pinks, gold bleeding into shadow. The buildings were dark shapes against the snow, substantial and well-built. A main house, a barn, a few outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney of the house, a thin gray line ascending into the gathering dusk. Ethan brought the wagon to a halt near the porch. Before he could move to help her down, the front door opened and a man emerged. He was older than Ethan, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. He wore a heavy coat and an expression of mild curiosity. Ethan, he said, who have you brought home? Ethan climbed down, then turned to offer Grace his hand. Cal, this is Miss Grace Hartley. She came from Boston to marry James Crawford. Found out when she arrived that James died 2 weeks back. Cal's face shifted, softened. I am sorry, miss. James was a good man. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. She needs work, Ethan continued. I hired her on as cook, figured you would not object. Cal studied Grace for a long moment. Then he smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face into something warm, almost grandfatherly. Object hell, son. I have been begging you to find someone who can cook for 2 years now. I am tired of burned biscuits and meat that could sole boots. He turned to Grace. Welcome, Miss Hartley. You are a godsend, whether you know it or not. Something in Grace's chest wound tight for so long, she had forgotten it was there, loosened just a fraction. These men strangers who owed her nothing were offering her safety. Work. A place to be. It felt too easy, too good. She waited for the trap to spring, but Cal simply gestured toward the house. Come inside. You must be frozen clear through. We will get you settled, then you can see the kitchen and start making plans. Ethan here has many talents, but cooking is not among them. The interior of the house was warm and sparse. Simple furniture, clean but worn. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing behind an iron screen. The floors were wood-scarred by years of boots, but swept clean. It was a man's house, functional without softness or decoration, but it did not feel cold, just honest. Cal showed her to a small room off the kitchen. It held a narrow bedroom, a chest of drawers, a chair by a window. The quilt on the bed was old, but well-made, the pattern simple. A wash basin sat on the dresser, and someone had left a pitcher of water beside it. Not much, Cal said apologetically. But it is yours. Lock on the door if you want privacy. We will not disturb you. Grace set her bag on the bed. It is more than enough. Thank you. Cal nodded. Yupper in an hour if you are up to it. No pressure. You have had a long journey. When he left, closing the door quietly behind him, Grace sat on the bed and let herself feel the full weight of exhaustion. She had been running on fear and adrenaline for weeks, hardly sleeping, always listening for footsteps behind her. Now in this small room in the middle of nowhere, she allowed herself to simply stop. She wept. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet release of all the terror and grief she had been carrying. Tears for the life she had left, brutal as it was. Tears for the future she had imagined with James Crawford, a man she had never met, but had pinned all her desperate hopes upon. Tears for the girl she had been before Richard, before the bruises, before the fear became a permanent resident in her bones. When the tears finally stopped, she washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher, looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. Her face was pale, thinner than it used to be, dark circles beneath her eyes. But she was here. She was alive. And for the first time in 4 years, no one knew where she was. That night, Grace cooked her first meal for the men of Northridge Ranch. She found the kitchen well-stocked, if a bit disorganized. Flour and salt, dried beans, a ham hanging in the cold room. She made biscuits, pan-fried the ham-boiled beans with a bit of molasses and mustard she found in the cupboard. Simple food, the kind that stuck to ribs and provided warmth against the cold. When she set the plates before Ethan and Cal, both men looked at the food as if it were a miracle. Cal took a bite of biscuit and closed his eyes. Miss Hartley, if you can cook like this all winter, I will personally ensure you want for nothing. Even Ethan, who had been silent through the meal preparation, nodded. It is good. Thank you. Grace ate little, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to accept much food. But she watched the men eat, saw their appreciation, and felt something small and warm kindle in her chest. Pride, perhaps, or just the simple satisfaction of being useful, being valued for something other than her status as a wife. After supper, while Grace cleaned the dishes, Cal sat by the fire with a pipe, and Ethan checked the horses one final time before the storm hit in full. The wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the house, rattling the windows in their frames. Snow was falling harder now, thick and fast, erasing the world beyond the porch. When Ethan came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he found Grace standing by the kitchen window, looking out into the white darkness. Storm will last 3 days, maybe 4, he said. We are well stocked. Nothing to fear. Grace turned to look at him. In the lamplight, his face was all plains and shadows. Why did you help me? She asked quietly. You do not know me. I could be anyone. Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then he said, someone should have stopped for me once, long time ago. No one did. I do not forget that. He did not elaborate, did not explain. Just moved past her to check the fire, adding another log, making sure the house would stay warm through the night. Grace stood there, his words settling into her like stones dropped into a well. Someone should have stopped for me. What had happened to this quiet, stoic man? What pain had he carried that made him see her desperation and respond without question? She did not ask. Some wounds were too private for sharing, especially between strangers. But she filed the words away, a piece of the puzzle that was Ethan Caldwell. That night, Grace slept deeply for the first time in months. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the quilts heavy and warm. The sound of the storm outside was oddly comforting, a white noise that drowned out thought. And the lock on her door, small and simple, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She did not hear the lone rider who stopped at the edge of town that night, asking questions at the saloon. Did not see the man in the expensive coat as he showed a photograph to the barkeeper, asking if anyone had seen the woman in the picture. Did not know that in his pocket he carried a telegram from a helpful citizen who thought she was doing the right thing by informing a worried husband about the whereabouts of his missing wife. Richard Hartley's man had found Mason Creek, and winter, for all its white beauty, was about to show its teeth. But in her small room at Northridge Ranch, Grace Hartley slept peacefully, dreaming of a future that might hold something other than fear. The storm wrapped the ranch in isolation, a temporary fortress of snow and wind. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the warm house, the simple rhythm of work, the quiet company of men who asked no questions and expected only honesty and labor. Grace rose before dawn each morning as she had been trained to do in Richard's house. But here the early morning held no dread. She lit the stove, started coffee, began the slow meditative work of making bread. The kitchen became her domain, a place where she had control, where her hands created something good and nourishing. Cal and Ethan treated her with a careful respect that felt alien at first. They thanked her for meals. They cleaned their own plates. They did not raise their voices or make demands. When they spoke to her, they looked at her face, not through her as if she were furniture or property. On the second day of the storm, Grace noticed Ethan watching her from across the room. She had jumped when a log in the fireplace cracked loudly, spilling embers. Her hand had flown to her throat in an unconscious gesture of protection, and for a moment the fear that lived in her bones had risen to the surface. When she looked up, Ethan's eyes were on her. Not with judgment, but with understanding. He knew. Maybe not the details, but he recognized the shape of trauma, the way it lived in the body even after the immediate danger had passed. He did not say anything, just held her gaze for a moment, nodded slightly, then returned to the harness he was mending. It was a small thing, that nod, but it said, "I see you, I understand, you are safe here." On the third day, when the storm finally began to ease, Cal brought up the subject of the 3 orphaned children in town. "Pastor Weller mentioned them in his last letter," Cal said over breakfast. "Samuel Lilly and Benjamin Tucker. Parents died of fever 3 months back. No kin willing to take them. Town has been scrambling to figure out what to do with them." Ethan frowned. "What will happen to them?" "Do not know. Orphanages back east, most likely. Get split up, sent to different places." Cal shook his head. "Damn shame. Samuel is 9, old enough to work. Could be useful around a ranch." Grace set down her coffee cup carefully. "And the younger 2. Girl is 6, boy is 4. Too young to be much help with labor, but children need homes." Cal looked at Grace, then at Ethan. "Been thinking, this house is too big for 2 men and a cook. Room enough for a family if anyone wanted one." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Ethan said nothing, but Grace saw his jaw tighten, saw the brief flash of pain that crossed his face before he shuddered it away. "I will think on it," Ethan said finally, and the subject was dropped. But Grace thought about it. Thought about 3 children with no one to want them, no place to call home. Thought about how she might have ended up in a similar situation if she had been younger, if her mother had died before finding her a husband, if the world had been just slightly more cruel. That afternoon, when the storm finally broke and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, Grace asked Ethan if she could accompany him on the next trip to town. She needed supplies for the kitchen, she said, fabric to make new curtains if such things could be found. What she did not say was that she wanted to see the children. Wanted to look into their faces and see if what she suspected was true, that they carried the same hollowed-out look she saw in her own reflection. The look of people who had learned that the world could take everything and leave you with nothing but breath. Ethan agreed without question. We ride out tomorrow morning. Town is 8 miles. If the roads are clear, we make it there and back before dark. That night, Grace stood at her window and looked out at the transformed landscape. The storm had buried everything under feet of snow, smoothing the rough edges of the world into soft, deceptive curves. It looked peaceful, beautiful, but she knew how quickly that beauty could kill, how cold could creep into bones and steal warmth and life, how isolation could be both salvation and trap. Somewhere out there beyond the white expanse, beyond the mountains and plains and all the miles she had traveled, Richard was searching. She could feel it in the way her heart sometimes raced for no reason, the way her hands trembled when she heard unexpected sounds, the way she checked the locks on her door 3 times before sleeping. But tonight, with tomorrow's trip to town looming, and the memory of Ethan's quiet kindness still warm in her chest, Grace allowed herself a small measure of hope. Maybe here in this hard land among these hard but decent men, she could finally become someone other than Richard Hartley's escaped wife. Maybe she could become simply Grace, a woman, a cook, a person who mattered for what she did not, who she belonged to. She did not let herself think beyond tomorrow, did not let herself imagine a future more than a few days ahead. That way lay disappointment. That way lay the crushing weight of hope destroyed. But tomorrow she could manage. Tomorrow she would go to town, see what this new world held, and take one more step away from the woman she had been. Outside, the stars emerged as the clouds finally cleared, cold and distant and beautiful. Grace pressed her hand against the cold window glass and whispered a prayer to a God she was not sure still listened to women like her. A prayer for safety, for time, for the chance to breathe without fear. In the barn, Ethan Caldwell stood in the darkness, running his hand along the flank of his horse, thinking about the woman in his house, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the bruises he had glimpsed on her wrist when her sleeve rode up, the desperate relief in her eyes when he had offered her work. He knew running when he saw it, knew fear. 5 years ago he had run from his own demons, though his had been made of grief and guilt rather than violence. His wife Sarah had begged him not to work during that terrible winter storm. Their son Daniel had just begun to cough, that rattling sound that meant fever was coming. But Ethan had thought himself invincible, thought he could provide and protect through sheer will and hard labor. He had been wrong. By the time he returned from checking Cal's northern fence line, both Sarah and Daniel were burning with fever. The doctor had come too late. Diphtheria, he had said. Nothing to be done. They had died within days of each other, and Ethan had wanted to follow them into the ground. For 5 years he had worked himself to exhaustion, slept little, spoke less, had become a ghost in his own life, moving through the motions of living without actually being alive. And then Grace Hartley had appeared, trembling and desperate, and something in him had recognized something in her. 2 people who had survived when perhaps they should not have. 2 people trying to figure out how to live in the aftermath of devastation. Ethan did not know what the future held, did not know if Grace would stay beyond the winter, did not know if he could bear to have another person close enough to lose. But he knew he would protect her. Whatever she was running from, whoever might come looking, Ethan would stand between her and harm. It was the least he could do. The only thing perhaps that might balance the scales for all the times no one had stood for him. Tomorrow they would go to town. And tomorrow, though neither of them knew it yet, the first threads of a larger pattern would begin to weave themselves together. 3 children who needed a home. A woman who needed to be needed. A man who needed to remember how to care. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch, a threat moving closer with every passing hour, carried on hooves through snow and determination, and the terrible, relentless logic of possession. But tonight there was only the quiet and the cold, and 2 damaged people finding their way towards something that might, if they were careful and lucky, resemble peace. The road to Mason Creek cut through landscape that seemed designed to humble human ambition. Endless white plains stretched to horizons that never came closer, no matter how long the wagon rolled forward. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of more snow. Grace sat beside Ethan on the wagon bench, the wool scarf still wrapped around her neck, and tried to memorize the feeling of moving through space without fear. 4 days had passed since the storm cleared. 4 days of rising before dawn to light the stove, of kneading bread dough until her arms ached, of learning the particular preferences of the men she cooked for. Cal liked his coffee strong enough to dissolve spoons. Ethan ate without comment, but she noticed he always finished everything on his plate, scraping it clean with the edge of his biscuit. The work was harder than anything she had done in Richard's house, where servants had handled the actual labor, and Grace had merely supervised, played hostess, smiled prettily at dinner parties. Here, her hands bore flour and burns from the stove. Her back protested the long hours standing, but the ache felt honest, earned. No one questioned whether she deserved rest. If she worked, she rested, simple as winter arithmetic. Ethan had said little during the journey, which Grace was learning was his natural state. He spoke when words were necessary, remained silent when they were not. It was restful, that silence. No need to fill space with chatter, no minefield of conversation where one wrong word could trigger explosion. But she had begun to notice things in that silence. The way he checked the horizon constantly, eyes scanning for threats she could not see. The way his hand stayed near the rifle propped beside him, casual but ready. The way he guided the horses with such gentle competence, never harsh, never impatient. These were the tells of a man who had learned caution the hard way and who carried watchfulness in his bones. "Town ahead," Ethan said, breaking 2 hours of quiet. Grace looked up and saw buildings emerging from the white landscape like ships from fog. Mason Creek was small, maybe 24 structures clustered around a single main street. A church with a simple wooden cross, a general store, a saloon with faded paint. The buildings had that raw, unfinished quality of places built quickly and practically without thought for beauty or permanence. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, bundled against the cold, their breath creating small clouds. A few looked up as the wagon passed, curiosity plain on their faces. Grace felt their stares like physical weight. New people in small towns were events. Strangers were stories waiting to be told, judged, incorporated into the community's narrative, or rejected from it. Ethan brought the wagon to a halt outside the general store. Before Grace could move to climb down, he was there offering his hand. She took it, noting again the calluses, the strength tempered by control. His hand released hers the moment her feet touched ground. "I have business at the Feed and Seed," Ethan said. "Meet you back here in an hour." Grace nodded. An hour of freedom, of moving through space on her own terms. It felt like wealth. The general store smelled of coffee and pickles and new fabric. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked up from behind the counter as Grace entered. His gaze traveled over her worn coat, her too thin frame, the eastern cut of her dress beneath the practical shawl. "Help you," his tone suggested he doubted it. "I need fabric," Grace said, keeping her voice level. "Cotton for dish towels, muslin if you have it." The man, whose name she would later learn was Jeremiah Lynch, made no move to show her merchandise. "You from the Northridge place?" "I work there. As cook." Something flickered across his face. Disapproval, maybe. Or just the automatic suspicion small towns reserve for outsiders. "Cash or credit?" "Cash." She counted out the coins Ethan had given her for supplies, watching Lynch's expression shift slightly as he realized she could pay. Money at least spoke a language everyone understood. While Lynch cut fabric with grudging efficiency, Grace became aware of another presence in the store. An older woman, perhaps in her 60s, stood examining canned goods with the intensity of someone not actually interested in what she was looking at. She was watching Grace in the reflection of the store window, her posture rigid with judgment. When Grace turned to face her directly, the woman did not have the grace to look away. She was tall, expensively dressed for a frontier town, with silver hair pulled back in a severe style that suggested she had made peace with being handsome rather than beautiful. "You must be the woman Ethan Caldwell brought to the ranch," the woman said. Not a question, an accusation dressed in observation. "I am Grace Hartley. I work as cook for Mr. Northridge and Mr. Caldwell." "Adelaide Porter." The woman did not offer her hand. "I knew James Crawford. Such a tragedy his passing, though I must say I find it curious that a woman would travel all this way to marry a man she had never met." The criticism was clear beneath the veneer of polite conversation. Grace had heard that tone before in Boston drawing rooms where women sharpened their tongues on each other's reputations. "Curious times make for curious choices," Grace said evenly. Mrs. Porter's lips thinned. "Indeed. Though I hope you understand how your situation might appear to others. A young unmarried woman living in a house with two unmarried men. I am sure you can appreciate why some in town might have concerns about the moral character such an arrangement suggests." Grace felt heat rising in her chest, not embarrassment, but anger. The kind of anger that had been building for years, compressed under layers of fear and compliance, now finding a crack to escape through. I can assure you, Mrs. Porter, that my character is my own concern, as is my living arrangement, which is entirely proper and involves honest work for honest wages. Proper. Mrs. Porter repeated the word as if tasting something sour. We shall see. Small towns have long memories, Miss Hartley. People remember who belongs and who does not. Before Grace could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Pastor Weller entered, bringing with him a gust of cold air and three small figures bundled in coats too large for them. Ah, Miss Hartley. The pastor's face brightened with genuine warmth. I was hoping to see you. And Mrs. Porter, good morning. Mrs. Porter offered a tight smile and moved toward the door. Pastor, I must be going. So much to do. Her eyes flicked once more to Grace, conveying everything. Words did not. Then she swept out with the kind of exit that suggested she had been raised on stages. Grace barely noticed. Her attention had fixed on the three children, standing close to Pastor Weller, like birds huddled against winter. The oldest was a boy, perhaps 9, with dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge. The middle child was a girl 6 or so, nearly disappearing inside a coat that dragged on the floor. The youngest was a boy of 4, his face round and solemn, one small hand gripping the pastor's coat. These are the Tucker children, Pastor Weller said gently. Samuel, Lily, and Benjamin. Children, this is Miss Grace Hartley. Samuel's eyes met hers, and Grace saw herself reflected there. The watchfulness, the fear poorly hidden beneath a thin shell of bravery, the readiness to run or fight or do whatever survival demanded. This boy had learned the lessons she knew too well. The world was not safe. Adults could not be trusted. Every kindness might be the prelude to cruelty. Hello, Grace said softly, crouching down so she was at their level. I am pleased to meet you. Samuel said nothing. Lily pressed closer to her brother. Benjamin stuck his thumb in his mouth, then took it out quickly as if remembering he was supposed to be too old for such comfort. They are good children, Pastor Weller said, and Grace heard the desperation beneath his kind tone. Smart, hardworking. Samuel here reads better than most adults. Grace understood. This was not casual introduction. This was plea. Their parents, she asked quietly, though she already knew. Fever took them 3 months past. We have been trying to find placement, but no one in town has room or resources for 3 more mouths, especially not with winter here. Samuel's jaw clenched, and Grace watched him try to make himself smaller, less burdensome. Watched him calculate his worth in the eyes of adults who saw children as economic propositions. She knew that calculation. Had made it herself more times than she could count. What will happen to them? Grace asked. There is an orphanage in Cheyenne. They could go there, but they would likely be separated, sent to different families or institutions. Pastor Weller's voice grew heavy. Samuel is old enough to be useful. He would probably find placement. But Lily and Benjamin, they are young, more difficult to place. Grace looked at the 3 children, saw their thin faces, their too large eyes, the way they held themselves as if trying not to take up space, saw the fear they tried so hard to hide. The door opened again and Ethan entered. His eyes found Grace immediately, then shifted to the children, to Pastor Weller. He read the situation in a glance, the way he seemed to read everything through observation rather than words. Problem, Pastor? Ethan asked. Pastor Weller explained, voice careful about the children, about the lack of options, about the terrible choices that poverty and circumstance forced upon the innocent. Ethan listened without interrupting. When the pastor finished, Ethan was silent for a long moment. Grace watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to name. Pain, definitely. Memory. Something that looked like longing and grief woven together. Then he looked at Grace. Really looked at her, and she understood that this was a question, not a decision he could make alone. They had been strangers 4 days ago. She was his employee, not his partner. Yet somehow in this moment, he was asking her opinion, trusting her judgment. Grace thought about the empty rooms at the ranch, thought about the way the house had felt when she arrived hollow, despite its warmth, missing something essential. Thought about these 3 children who had lost everything and were about to lose even each other. She thought about the girl she had been newly married, hopeful before the first time Richard's fist had taught her the difference between vows and truth. If someone had helped that girl, If someone had seen the bruises starting to form and offered her a way out, if someone had cared enough to intervene, finito, they could stay with us, Grace heard herself say. At the ranch, we have room. Ethan's eyes held hers for another long moment. Then he nodded, a single sharp movement of decision made. Pastor, Ethan said, seems to me that ranch could use an extra hand. Boy Samuel's age can learn plenty. Useful work. He looked at the younger two. And a house is better with children in it. Keeps it from getting too quiet. Pastor Weller's face transformed, relief flooding through the lines of worry. Are you certain this is not a small commitment? Certain enough, Ethan said. Cal and I discussed the possibility before. He will approve. Samuel was looking between Grace and Ethan with an expression of fierce suspicion. Why would you take us? You do not know us. We are not your problem. The words were hostile, defensive. The words of a child who had learned that adults' kindness was often just a long way to disappointment. Grace met his eyes. You are right, we do not know you, but that does not mean you are not worth knowing. And it does not mean you should face winter alone. We will not be charity cases, Samuel said. I work, I earn our keep. Good, Ethan said, because there is plenty of work. But first there is learning. Reading, writing, arithmetic. Pastor Weller can help with that. Something in Samuel's posture shifted slightly. The mention of learning, of being invested in rather than merely used, had reached some part of him he thought he had closed off. Lily whispered something to her brother. Samuel translated. She wants to know if there will be food. Grace felt her heart crack. Yes, honey, there will always be food. As much as you need, I promise. Within the hour, the children's few possessions were loaded onto the wagon. A small trunk between the three of them. A rag doll that Lily clutched. A wooden top that Benjamin held carefully. A book that Samuel tried to hide as if literacy might be seen as presumption. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the morning's journey, but different. The children sat in the wagon bed wrapped in blankets, watching the landscape pass with wide eyes. Grace turned several times to check on them, and each time found Samuel watching her back, assessing, judging, deciding whether trust was possible. Cal was on the porch when they arrived, pipe in hand, expression curious. When he saw the children, his eyebrows rose, but he did not look displeased. Found some help, did you? He asked Ethan. Seemed like the right thing, Ethan replied, helping the children down. Cal studied the three for a moment, then smiled. Well now, house has been too quiet. Good to have young people around again. He looked at Samuel. You know how to milk a cow, son? No, sir. Good. Means I get to teach you. Nothing I like better than teaching someone who does not yet know how much work it is. Cal winked and Samuel's serious face cracked just slightly. Grace showed the children to a room on the second floor. It was larger than hers with 2 beds and space enough for a pallet on the floor for Benjamin. The room was dusty, clearly unused for years, but the bones of it were good. Windows that let in light, a solid door, a small stove in the corner that could be lit when the cold got fierce. We will clean it tomorrow, Grace said. Make it yours. For now, rest. Get warm. I will call you for supper. Lily tugged at Grace's skirt. When Grace bent down, the little girl whispered in her ear, Are you going to send us away? Grace's throat tightened. No, sweetheart. You are home now. That night, Grace cooked a feast. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy biscuits, carrots glazed with butter and honey. She watched the children eat, saw the way they took small bites at first testing, making sure the food was real and would not be snatched away. Then as certainty grew, they ate with the focused intensity of people who had known hunger and feared its return. Benjamin fell asleep at the table, face half in his mashed potatoes. Ethan carried him upstairs with a gentleness that made Grace's chest ache. Samuel and Lily followed exhaustion, finally overtaking vigilance. After the children were settled and the dishes cleaned, Grace stood at the kitchen window looking out at the darkness beyond. Behind her, she heard Ethan enter, his footsteps distinctive, careful not to startle. You did a good thing today, he said quietly. We did a good thing, Grace corrected. I could not have brought them here without your agreement. You knew I would agree. She turned to look at him. In the lamplight, his face was softer than usual, some of the hardness worn away. How did I know that? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Because you see me, not many people do. The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Grace suddenly aware of how alone they were, how the space between them felt charged with something she could not name. "What happened to your family?" she asked softly. "Your wife and child?" She expected him to deflect, to retreat behind silence as he so often did. But instead he spoke. "Diphtheria. 5 years ago, almost to the day. Sarah and Daniel." His voice was rough, scraped raw by memory. "I was out checking fence line during a storm. Cal needed help. Daniel had started coughing that morning, but I thought it was nothing. Just winter sickness. Sarah told me to stay. I did not listen." He paused, jaw working. "By the time I got back 2 days later, they were both burning with fever. Doctor said there was nothing to be done. They died within 3 days of each other. Daniel first, then Sarah. She made me promise before she went. Made me promise I would not freeze my heart. That I would keep living, keep caring." "And did you keep that promise?" Grace asked. "No." The word was simple, honest. "I broke it every day for 5 years, until 4 days ago." The implications settled between them like snow falling. Grace understood. She had thawed something in him, just as he had offered her safety. Two broken people trying to remember how to be whole. But before she could respond, before she could acknowledge what was growing between them, there was a sound outside. Hoofbeats. A horse approaching fast through the night. Ethan's hand went to the rifle by the door, his entire body shifting into alertness. "Stay inside." He stepped onto the porch. Grace ignored his instruction, following but staying in the doorway. A rider emerged from the darkness, bundled against the cold. As he came closer, lamplight revealed a young man, perhaps 30, with a face creased by worry and exhaustion. "Mr. Caldwell," the rider called. "That is right. Who are you?" "Name is Owen. Owen Hartley. I am looking for a woman. Grace Hartley. I was told she might be here." Grace felt the world tilt. Hartley. Richard's family name. The name she still carried like a brand. Her hand found the door frame, gripping hard to keep herself upright. Ethan must have seen her reaction, because his voice when he spoke was hard as winter ground. "What business do you have with Miss Hartley?" Owen dismounted slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. "I have news. Important news. Is she here? Is she safe?" Ethan did not answer. Instead, he looked back at Grace, silently asking if she wanted to face this, giving her the choice. Grace stepped forward into the lamplight, heart hammering against her ribs. "I am Grace Hartley," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "Who are you?" Owen's eyes found her, and she saw something in them. Relief and fear. "Mrs. Hartley, I am Owen, Richard's brother, and I have come to warn you. Richard knows where you are, and he is coming." The night seemed to contract around those words, squeezing out air and warmth and safety. Grace heard her own breath, too fast, too shallow. Felt her vision narrow to pinpoints. Richard. Coming. How she managed. How does he know? Someone in town sent a telegram to Boston. A Mrs. Adelaide Porter. She thought she was helping a worried husband find his missing wife. She did not know. Owen's voice was thick with regret. "Richard hired Pinkerton agents. They have been searching everywhere. When he got the telegram, he left immediately. He should be here within a week, maybe less." Ethan stepped between Grace and Owen, protective. "Why are you here? Why warn her?" Owen's face twisted. "Because I know what my brother is. I have known for years and done nothing. I am a coward, but I cannot let him hurt her again. I cannot stand by anymore." Grace felt the world spinning, felt all the fragile safety she had built over 4 days crumbling like sand castles before tide. Richard was coming, the monster who had promised she could never escape. And he was bringing with him all the power of law and money and righteous fury of a wronged husband. She looked at Ethan, at this man who had offered her work when she was desperate, who had helped children because it was right, who had begun to thaw from his own winter because of her presence. She could not let him be destroyed by her past. "I have to leave," she whispered. "I have to run again." But Ethan's hand found hers in the darkness, gripped tight, anchoring. "No," he said, voice steady and sure. "No more running. We face this together." Above them, unnoticed by all three, Samuel stood at the upstairs window, watching the scene below with the sharp intelligence of a child who understood that the fragile peace of the past few hours was already shattering. He had known it was too good to last. Safety always was. But he had wanted to believe. For Lily and Benjamin, he had wanted to believe that this time, this place, these people might be different. Now he watched the woman who had promised them food and safety, the man who had carried his baby brother to bed with such gentle care, and the stranger whose words had brought terror back into the night. Samuel made a decision. If the bad man was coming, if Grace was in danger, then Samuel would protect her. The way no one had protected his mother when the fever came. The way no one had protected his family when the world decided they did not matter. He was 9 years old, but 9 was old enough to fight, old enough to stand, old enough to refuse to run. In the darkness of Mason Creek, 8 miles away, a man in an expensive coat sat in the saloon nursing whiskey and asking careful questions. He had learned that a woman matching his employer's description worked at the North Ridge Ranch, that she had arrived just days ago alone desperate, that she cooked for 2 unmarried men and had just today taken in 3 orphaned children. Dale Morrison smiled into his glass. Richard Hartley paid well for information, and tomorrow Morrison would send another telegram east confirming the target's location. Then he would wait. Men like Hartley did not let their property escape. They came, they reclaimed, they punished, and Dale Morrison would have a front row seat to watch it happen. The night deepened. Snow began to fall again, soft and inevitable. At Northridge Ranch, Grace stood in Ethan's grip, feeling the weight of the future pressing down. Owen waited for her response, his own guilt and fear written plain on his face. And upstairs, 3 children slept dreaming, perhaps of safety, not knowing that the world was about to teach them, once again, that safety was always temporary. The only question now was how much they would lose before learning that lesson, and whether this time anyone would fight back. The days after Owen's warning moved with the strange quality of dreams, where time stretches and contracts without reason. Grace woke each morning expecting to see Richard's face at the window, his hands reaching for her throat. But each morning brought only the familiar sounds of the ranch, waking Cal's heavy footsteps on the stairs, Ethan's quiet movements in the barn, the children's whispered conversations in their room. Owen stayed. Cal had offered him a place in the bunkhouse work to earn his keep. The younger Hartley brother was gone from travel, haunted by guilt that sat on his shoulders like physical weight. Grace watched him with the children, saw how gently he spoke to them, how carefully he moved around her, as if afraid his very presence might shatter something fragile. On the 3rd day after his arrival, Owen found Grace alone in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with methodical precision. The work calmed her, gave her hands something to do while her mind spun in circles of fear and planning. "I need you to understand," Owen said quietly, standing in the doorway. "I should have stopped him years ago. The first time I saw bruises on your arms, the first time I heard you cry through the walls, I told myself it was not my place, that marriage was private, that Richard would change." Grace did not stop kneading. The rhythm was important. Full press turn, full press turn. "Why did you finally decide to act?" she asked. Owen's voice cracked. "Because he killed someone. A young man, Thomas, who tried to help you, and Richard bought his way out of justice. I watched him do it, watched him smile at the funeral, and I knew if I did not do something, you would be next, and I would have to live the rest of my life knowing I could have saved you and chose not to." Grace finally looked up at him, saw the tears on his face, the genuine remorse. "Does he know you came here?" "No, I told him I was going to check business prospects in Denver. He trusts me because I have always been weak, always done what he wanted." Owen's hands clenched. "But not this time. This time I choose the right side, even if it costs me everything." The bread dough had been kneaded enough. Grace shaped it into loaves, placed them in greased pans, covered them with cloth. "What will you do when he arrives?" "I will stand with you. I have evidence. Medical records I stole from his files. Testimonies from servants who were willing to speak if promised protection. Proof of the payment he made to cover up Thomas's death." Owen pulled a leather satchel from his coat. "It is all here. Everything we need to show what he really is." Grace felt something shift in her chest. Hope dangerous and intoxicating. Will it be enough? I do not know. The law favors husbands. But truth has power, and I have to believe that matters. That night, Grace could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the house settle, hearing the wind test the windows. Her mind would not quiet, replaying every moment of her marriage to Richard. The honeymoon when he had been charming and attentive, everything she had dreamed. The first time his mood had shifted sudden as summer storm over some imagined slight. The first slap followed by tears and apologies and promises it would never happen again. The lies she had told herself, the excuses she had made, the way she had learned to walk carefully through her own life, always watching, always calculating, trying to predict the unpredictable. Around midnight, the nightmare came. She was back in the Boston townhouse. Richard's hands were around her throat, squeezing, squeezing. His face was twisted with rage, spittle flying as he screamed words she could not hear over the roaring in her ears. She tried to fight, but her arms would not move. Tried to scream, but no sound came. The world was going dark at the edges, narrowing to a pinpoint, and she knew this was how she would die in this house, belonging to this man never having known freedom. She woke screaming. The sound tore from her throat raw, an animal pulled from some deep place where terror lived. Her hands clawed at her neck, trying to remove fingers that were not there. She could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the phantom pressure crushing her windpipe. The door burst open. Ethan stood there in shirt sleeves and suspenders, hair disheveled, eyes wild with alarm. He took in the scene in a glance, Grace tangled in sheets, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. "Grace," his voice cut through the panic. "Grace, you are safe. I am here." He did not approach immediately, did not crowd her space, just stood in the doorway, hands visible, voice steady, giving her room to remember where she was. Slowly, so slowly, the present world filtered back. The small room, the quilt Cal's wife had made years ago, the sound of wind outside, clean and cold. Not the townhouse, not Richard's hands. Safe. She was safe. "I am sorry," she whispered, voice hoarse. "I am so sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for." Ethan moved closer now, sat in the chair by her bed, keeping distance but offering presence. "Nightmare." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "Want to talk about it?" She shook her head. Then, surprising herself, she started talking anyway. "I married him when I was 22. Richard Hartley. He was 35, established, respectable. My father was dead. My mother was ill. Richard offered security. I thought I was lucky." The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. She told him about the honeymoon, about the first time Richard hit her, about the years of walking on eggshells, trying to be perfect, trying to be small enough not to provoke him. "He told me I was his property, that I had no value except what he gave me, that no one would want damaged goods." Her voice broke. "I tried to leave twice. The second time he broke my arm, told the doctor I fell, and the doctor looked at me with pity but said nothing, because the law was on Richard's side, because I was his wife." Ethan's jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jump. His hands were fists controlled, but trembling with suppressed rage. "Where is he now?" Ethan asked, voice low and dangerous. "Coming here. Owen said 2 weeks, maybe less. And when he arrives," Grace looked at him, really looked at him. This man who had offered her work without questions, who had taken in 3 orphan children because it was right, who sat now in her room in the middle of the night listening to her pain without judgment or dismissal. "When he arrives, he will try to take me back. The law says I am his. A telegram to the right judge, a warrant for runaway wife, and I have no legal standing. He will drag me back to Boston, and this time he will make sure I never leave again." No. The word was absolute, final. "That will not happen. Ethan, you do not understand. He has money, power, the law. And I have this land, these people, and what is right." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Grace Hartley, hear me now. You are not going back to that man. Not while I draw breath. Not while I can stand between you and him." "Why?" The question came out broken. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, barely contained. "Because someone should have done it for you years ago. Because no one did it for me when I needed it. Because you are not property. You are a person. And you deserve to live without fear." Something in Grace's chest cracked open. A place that had been frozen solid, protecting her from hope, because hope hurt too much when it died. But Ethan's words, his steady presence, the absolute conviction in his voice, it thawed something essential. "I am afraid," she whispered. "I know, fear is honest. But you do not face it alone anymore." He stood, then moved toward the door to give her privacy. But Grace's voice stopped him. "Stay, please. Just for a while, I do not want to be alone." Ethan hesitated, then pulled the chair closer to her bed and sat, not touching, maintaining propriety, but near enough that she could hear him breathing, could feel his solid presence anchoring her to the present moment. They sat in silence until Grace's breathing evened, until her heartbeat slowed. Outside, an owl called, hunting through the winter night. Inside, two damaged people kept vigil together, neither sleeping, both holding space for the other's pain. As dawn began to gray, the window's Grace spoke again. "Tell me about them. Your wife and son." Ethan drew a long breath. For a moment, she thought he would refuse retreat into his customary silence. But then words came slow and careful, like a man picking his way through a field of broken glass. "Sarah was small, barely came up to my shoulder, but fierce. Lord, she was fierce. Argued with me about everything. Would not back down even when she was wrong, especially when she was wrong." A ghost of a smile touched his face. "She made me laugh. I had forgotten that was possible until I met her." And Daniel, 4 years old, had his mother's stubbornness and my quiet, would sit for hours watching birds learning their calls. He wanted to know everything. Why the sky was blue, where the wind came from, how plants knew to grow toward light. Ethan's voice thickened. I was going to teach him to ride that spring. Was going to show him how to rope cattle, how to read the weather in the clouds. "The fever came fast?" Grace asked gently. "Like a thief." Daniel started coughing on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Sarah was sick too. I sent for the doctor, but he was 3 towns over tending to an outbreak. By the time he arrived Friday, they were both gone. Grace saw the devastation on his face, the guilt that lived in the set of his shoulders. "It was not your fault. I should have been there, should have recognized the signs sooner, should have done something. Sometimes terrible things happen, and there is nothing anyone could have done." Grace reached out, placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. The touch was light, tentative, the first time she had initiated contact with a man in years. "You loved them. You did everything you could. The rest was just cruel luck." Ethan looked down at their hands, hers pale and small over his weathered one. He did not pull away. "Sarah made me promise before she died. Promise I would not close off, would not let grief turn me to stone. I broke that promise every day for 5 years. Until now. Until you." He turned his hand over, gently clasping hers. The touch was warm, careful, reverent. "You remind me what it feels like to care, to want to protect something, to believe the future might hold more than just going through motions." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were different from the fear tears earlier. These were softer, healing maybe. "I do not know how to trust this, how to believe it is real and not another trap. One day at a time, one moment at a time. We do not have to figure it all out tonight." They sat like that as full morning came, hands clasped, neither speaking, both feeling the fragile thing growing between them. Something that might, with time and care, become strong enough to weather what was coming. Downstairs, Samuel stood at the bottom of the staircase, having listened to the conversation through the floorboards. He understood more than adults gave him credit for. Understood that Grace was running from a bad man, that Ethan was choosing to protect her, that the ranch, their new home, was about to become a battleground. He slipped back to the room he shared with his siblings, looked at Lily and Benjamin sleeping peacefully, and made a decision. Whatever happened, he would help. 9 years old was old enough to fight for people who had given them food and safety and something that felt almost like family. The letter arrived 3 days later. It came by special courier, a man who rode up to the ranch with official bearing and departed as soon as Cal signed for the delivery. The envelope was expensive paper sealed with wax, addressed to Grace Hartley in precise, educated script. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was written in a hand she did not recognize, but the message was clear. "Mrs. Hartley, I am writing to warn you. Your husband has hired Pinkerton agents to locate you. They have been searching every town west of the Mississippi. Someone in Mason Creek, a Mrs. Adelaide Porter, sent a telegram to Boston confirming your location. Mr. Hartley departed for Wyoming immediately upon receiving this news. He should arrive within 2 weeks. I am sending this letter ahead in hopes you can prepare or flee. I believe you deserve the chance to escape. A friend. Grace read the letter 3 times, each word landing like a physical blow. Mrs. Porter, the woman who had looked at her with such disdain in the general store, who had questioned her morals, her character, her right to be in Mason Creek. That woman had betrayed her, thinking she was reuniting a worried husband with his wayward wife. He is coming, Grace said numbly. Richard is coming. Ethan took the letter, read it quickly, his face hardening with each line. How long do we have? The letter is dated 5 days ago. If Richard left immediately, he could be here within a week. Then we prepare. Ethan's voice was iron. Cal needs to know. Owen needs to organize his evidence. And I need to speak with Pastor Weller and see who in town will stand with us. Stand with us. Grace looked at him. Ethan, most of the town thinks I am an improper woman living in sin. They will not help me. Some will, and some will change their minds when they hear the truth. He gripped her shoulders gently, forced her to meet his eyes. You are not running. Not this time. We face him together here with the truth. But in town, Mrs. Adelaide Porter was already at work. She held court in the general store, voice carrying to every corner, telling her version of events. A woman of questionable morals had appeared in town unmarried, living with 2 men. Now it turned out she was a runaway wife, an adulteress, possibly a thief. Her poor husband was traveling across the country to reclaim his wayward spouse. The sanctity of marriage must be upheld, Mrs. Porter declared to the assembled women. What message does it send to our young people if we allow wives to simply abandon their vows? If we shelter runaways and encourage dissolution of sacred bonds? Some women nodded, convinced by the rhetoric of duty and propriety, but others remained silent, troubled. They had seen Grace at church, had noticed how she flinched at sudden movements, how carefully she moved through space, had recognized perhaps something of themselves in her wariness. Jeremiah Lynch, emboldened by Mrs. Porter's crusade, announced he would no longer sell goods to Northridge Ranch. Not while they harbor that woman, he declared. I will not support immorality. But Pastor Weller, hearing of these developments, stood in his pulpit the following Sunday and preached a sermon that would be remembered in Mason Creek for years to come. There is a story, he began, voice ringing through the small church, of a woman caught in adultery. The law said she should be stoned, and men gathered righteous in their judgment stones in their hands, ready to execute justice. He paused, let the silence build. But Christ said, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And one by one the men dropped their rocks and walked away, because not one of them could claim perfect innocence. His eyes found Mrs. Porter in her usual pew. We have among us a woman who has fled from violence, who came here seeking not luxury or ease, but simply the chance to live without fear. And now there are those who would condemn her for breaking vows made to a man who broke his own vows when he first raised his hand against her. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Porter's face flushed crimson. I say to you now, we are not judges of this woman's morality. We are called to be defenders of the weak, protectors of the vulnerable. And if we send her back to a man who has harmed her, we are no better than the Pharisees who valued law over mercy. After the service, the town was divided. Some stood with Mrs. Porter, convinced that marriage vows were absolute, that wives belonged to husbands, regardless of circumstance. But others, moved by the pastor's words, began to question, began to remember their own struggles, their own moments of needing grace. Cal Northridge, using his considerable influence as one of the largest landowners in the territory, called a meeting with the mayor and marshal. Owen presented his evidence documents that painted a picture of systematic abuse of bribes paid of a young man dead because he tried to intervene. The marshal, a grizzled man named Davis, studied the papers with a frown. This is troubling, but legally a man has rights over his wife. If Mr. Hartley arrives with proper documentation warrants from Boston courts, I may have no choice but to enforce them. Even knowing what you know, Cal demanded, even seeing proof of violence. The law is not always just, Marshal Davis said heavily, but it is the law. That conversation reached Grace through Owen, who looked sick as he repeated it. She stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter, trying to absorb the reality. Even with evidence, even with witnesses, the law would likely side with Richard because she was his wife, his property under every legal definition that mattered. Then I have to run, she said. Before he arrives, I have to disappear again. No. Ethan's voice was absolute. He had entered the kitchen, silently had heard the whole exchange. You are not running. We are not giving up. Ethan, the law. Damn the law. His voice was fierce, louder than she had ever heard it. The law is wrong. And sometimes people have to stand up and say, so consequences be damned. Grace looked at him, this quiet man who was proposing to defy legal authority to risk everything for her. Why would you do this? Because it is right, because you matter. Because love means standing between the person you care about and the thing that would destroy them. The word hung in the air. Love. He had said it casually, as if it were obvious, as if it were simply fact. But it was the first time either of them had named what was growing between them. Grace felt her throat close with emotion. Ethan, I know it is too soon. I know we barely know each other. But I also know what I feel. And I feel like I would rather die than watch someone drag you back to hell. Before Grace could respond, before she could process the magnitude of what he had just confessed, the kitchen door burst open and Samuel ran in, face white with fear. There is a storm coming, the boy panted. Big one. I can see it on the horizon. Black clouds. Feels wrong. Ethan moved to the window, looked out at the sky. His expression darkened. Blizzard. Bad one by the look of it. We need to secure everything. Get the animals in. Board up what we can. The next hours were a blur of motion. Everyone worked, even the children. Bringing horses into the barn, securing shutters, filling the house with firewood and water. The sky turned from gray to black, and the wind began to howl with voices that sounded almost human. The storm hit like a fist. Snow came not in flakes but in sheets, horizontal walls of white, driven by wind that screamed. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the windows disappeared, erased by winter's fury. They huddled in the main house, all of them. Cal, Ethan, Owen, Grace, and the 3 children. The fire roared, but cold still found its way through cracks under doors, through any gap it could exploit. Outside, the storm raged with a violence that felt personal, as if winter itself had declared war. On the second day of the storm, disaster struck. Ethan went to check the barn, worried about the horses. The wind was a living thing trying to knock him down, freeze him where he stood. He made it to the barn, checked the animals, then started back. But a gust stronger than the rest caught the barn door, ripped it from his grip, sent it crashing. He tried to catch it to secure it before it damaged the barn structure. The door swung wild, caught him across the shoulder, knocked him off balance. He fell hard and heard the crack as his leg twisted beneath him, as something in his knee gave way. Pain, white and absolute, bloomed through his body. He tried to stand, could not. Tried to call for help, but the wind ate his voice. The cold was already seeping in, already looking for purchase. In the house, Grace noticed he had been gone too long. Fear, old and familiar, gripped her chest. She pulled on coat and boots, tied a rope around her waist, with the other end secured to the porch post, the way Ethan had taught her for storms. She found him 50 yards from the barn, half buried in snow, conscious but fading. His lips were blue eyes glazed with pain. Grace, he tried to say, but his jaw was too cold to form words properly. She could have left him, could have run back to the house, gotten help, saved herself. The thought flashed through her mind, instinctive, born of years with Richard, where self-preservation was the only law that mattered. But Grace was not that woman anymore. Or maybe she had always been capable of this, and Richard had just convinced her otherwise. She got her arms under Ethan's shoulders, began to pull. He was heavy, dead weight, and the snow was deep. Every yard was agony, her muscles screaming, lungs burning in the frigid air. But she pulled, inch by inch, foot by foot, following the rope back to safety. Cal saw them from the window, came running. Together they got Ethan inside, laid him by the fire. His leg was badly injured, swollen, possibly broken. Grace cut away his frozen pant leg, examined the damage with shaking hands. I need hot water, clean cloths, whiskey if we have it, she said, voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. She had watched Richard hurt people, had learned unwillingly how to tend wounds. Now that terrible knowledge would save the man she loved. She worked through the night, splinting the leg, keeping fever at bay, forcing water and broth past his lips. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in fever dreams, where he called for Sarah, for Daniel, for Grace. And Grace sat beside him, held his hand, whispered promises into the darkness. "You are not leaving me. Do you hear me?" Ethan Caldwell. "You are not leaving. I did not survive Richard just to lose you to Winter. You stay. You fight. You come back." The children watched wide-eyed. Samuel saw in Grace's fierce devotion an answer to questions he had not known how to ask. What love looked like. What it meant to choose someone. To fight for them. On the third day of the storm, Ethan's fever broke. He opened his eyes to find Grace asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hands still clasping his, her face drawn with exhaustion. He squeezed her hand gently and she woke instantly. "You stayed," he whispered. "Of course I stayed." Her eyes were bright with tears. "Did you think I would run? You could have. You could have left me and saved yourself." "No," Grace's voice was fierce. "I could not have. Not anymore. You have ruined me for running, Ethan Caldwell. You have made me brave." He smiled, weak but genuine. "Not me. You did that yourself." She leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his. "We are going to get through this. The storm, Richard, all of it, together." "Together," he echoed. The storm finally broke on the fourth morning. The world emerged white and new, sculptured by wind into shapes that defied logic. Snowdrifts taller than a man. Trees bent double under ice. A landscape transformed into something alien and beautiful and deadly. Cal went out first, checking damage, assessing what could be salvaged. When he came back, his face was grim. "We have tracks," he said. "Fresh ones. Someone came through last night late, stopped at the house, looked in the windows." Grace felt ice that had nothing to do with weather slide down her spine. "Who?" "Do not know, but they were alone and they stood at your window for a long time before leaving." Ethan struggled to sit up despite his injured leg. "Which direction did they go?" "Back toward town, following the main road." They all knew what it meant. Someone had come looking, had checked the house, seen Grace through her window, and now they knew for certain she was here. The waiting was over. The storm had provided brief shelter, but shelter was temporary. And somewhere out there, Richard Hartley was coming. Perhaps was already here in Mason Creek, planning his next move. Grace stood at the window looking out at the pristine snow that would soon be disturbed by footprints, by conflict, by the inevitable confrontation. Behind her, she heard the children moving about, heard Owen and Cal speaking in low voices, heard Ethan's labored breathing as he forced himself to stand, despite the pain. Her life had narrowed to this moment, this place, these people. The ranch that had offered her sanctuary. The man who had taught her she was worth protecting. The children who needed her to be strong. The brother-in-law who was trying to atone for his silence. She thought about the girl she had been in Boston, trembling and small, convinced she deserved the bruises, the fear, the slow death of her spirit. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had crossed a continent, who had pulled a wounded man through a blizzard, who had chosen to stay when running would have been easier. Richard was coming. Let him come. This time Grace would not be alone. This time she would fight. The sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow to diamonds. It was beautiful, that light, cold and pure and utterly indifferent to human struggle. But Grace found comfort in that indifference. The world did not care who Richard Hartley was, what power he wielded, what legal rights he claimed. The world simply was, and in that vast indifference there was freedom. She turned from the window to find Ethan watching her, understanding in his eyes. He extended his hand and she took it, their fingers intertwining with the ease of practice, of trust built through crisis. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we face it standing." "Standing," Grace agreed. Outside the tracks, in the snow, led away toward town, toward the inevitable confrontation, toward whatever future waited in the balance between law and justice, power and truth, fear and love. But inside Northridge Ranch, 7 people prepared to make their stand. Not because they were fearless, not because they were certain of victory, but because some things were worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. Some people were worth protecting even at great cost. Some truths were worth speaking even when silence would be safer. The storm had passed, but the real battle was only beginning. The footprints in the snow led Ethan and Cal to a grim conclusion. Someone had come in the night, watched the house, confirm Grace's presence, then returned to town. The question was not whether Richard knew where she was. The question was when he would come to claim her. The answer arrived 3 days later on a morning so cold that breath froze in the air and the world seemed made of glass. Grace was in the kitchen teaching Lily how to knead bread dough when she heard the horses. Not the usual sounds of the ranch, but multiple riders moving with purpose. Her hands stilled in the flour, her body going rigid with a recognition that lived deeper than thought. Danger. Threat. Him. Samuel appeared in the doorway, face pale. Men coming, a lot of them. Ethan hauled himself up from the chair where he had been resting his injured leg, reached for the rifle. Cal moved to the window, pulled back the curtain just enough to see. His face went hard. Marshal Davis, 2 deputies, and 2 men I do not recognize. One of them looks like money. Grace's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the counter, knuckles white. Richard. The knock on the door was authoritative, official. Cal opened it, blocking the entrance with his body. Marshal Davis stood on the porch, hat in hand, expression uncomfortable. Behind him stood a man Grace recognized, even though she had prayed never to see him again. Richard Hartley looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, handsome in a cold way, impeccably dressed despite days of travel. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, making him look distinguished rather than old. His eyes, when they found Grace through the open door, were the same eyes that haunted her nightmares. Possessive, certain, cruel beneath the civilized veneer. Mr. Northridge, Marshal Davis said to Cal, voice formal and strained, I have a warrant for the return of Grace Hartley to her lawful husband, Richard Hartley of Boston. She is wanted for abandonment of marriage vows and theft of property valued at over $5,000. Theft, Owen's voice came from behind Grace. He pushed forward, face flushed with anger. What theft? Richard's smile was smooth, practiced. My family's sapphire necklace, given to my wife on our wedding day. She took it when she fled our home. The necklace is a treasured heirloom, irreplaceable. Its theft constitutes grand larceny under Massachusetts law. Grace's hand flew to her throat where the necklace lay hidden beneath her dress. Richard had given it to her, had placed it around her neck himself, called it a gift, a symbol of his love. Now he was using it as a weapon, twisting a gift into evidence of crime. That is a lie, Owen said, stepping fully into view. You gave her that necklace freely. Richard's eyes found his brother, and something flickered there. Surprise quickly masked. Owen, what are you doing here? Stopping you. Owen's voice shook but held firm. Brother, this has to end. I have evidence of what you have done. Medical records, witness statements, proof of the bribes you paid to cover up Thomas's death. For just a moment, Richard's mask slipped. Rage flashed across his features, raw and violent. Then it was gone, replaced by concerned confusion. Thomas's death was a tragic accident. And Owen, you are unwell. The doctors in Boston said you were suffering from nervous exhaustion delusions. That is why I sent you west to recover in the clean air. When it was masterful the way Richard turned truth into weapon, making Owen's attempts to help sound like the ravings of a sick man, making himself the concerned brother burdened by family tragedy. Marshal Davis looked between them, uncertainty creasing his weathered face. Mr. Hartley, do you have the warrant? Richard produced papers from his coat, handed them to the marshal. Official documents with seals and signatures, court orders from Boston demanding the return of runaway wife Grace Hartley to her lawful husband. Grace felt the walls closing in, felt the trap she had tried so hard to escape springing shut around her. All the miles, all the fear, all the desperate hope, none of it mattered. The law was on Richard's side. It had always been on his side. Ethan moved to stand between Grace and the door, his injured leg making his stance uneven, but no less determined. She is not going anywhere. Marshal Davis's hand went to his gun, not drawing, but ready. Mr. Caldwell, I respect you, but I have legal paperwork here. If you interfere, I will have to arrest you. Then arrest me. Ethan's voice was quiet, absolute, because I am not moving. Richard watched this with amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. How noble, a crippled cowboy playing knight for a woman who is legally my property. Tell me, has she shared your bed yet? Or is she saving herself for when the law forces her back to her rightful husband? The words were designed to wound, to humiliate. Grace saw Ethan's jaw clench, saw the fury in his eyes. But he did not rise to the bait, did not give Richard the satisfaction of reaction. Grace is under my protection, Ethan said, and the protection of this community. Whatever your papers say, she came here fleeing violence. She has the right to safety. She has the right to fulfill her vows before God, Richard countered smoothly. For better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do us part. Those were her promises, or does she abandon promises as easily as she abandons her home? From upstairs came a small sound. Grace looked up to see all three children watching from the landing. Samuel's face was tight with anger, Lily's with fear. Benjamin had his thumb in his mouth, eyes wide and uncomprehending. Seeing them, seeing their terror and confusion, something shifted in Grace. She thought of all the years she had spent trying to be small, trying to be invisible, trying to avoid Richard's wrath by erasing herself. Thought of the woman she had been convinced she deserved the bruises, the fear, the slow death of her spirit. That woman was gone, and the woman who stood here now would not let these children watch her be dragged away like property, would not teach them through her silence and surrender that might made right. I will go, she heard herself say. The words fell into stunned silence. Ethan turned to stare at her, betrayal and disbelief warring on his face. Owen's mouth opened in protest. Even Richard looked surprised, though he recovered quickly. Grace, no, Ethan said. You do not have to do this. She met his eyes, trying to communicate something she could not say aloud with the marshal and Richard listening. Trust me. Please, just trust me. I do have to, she said clearly. He is right. I am his wife under the law. I took vows. And I took the necklace, though it was given as a gift. If the law says I must return, then I will return. She moved toward the door, and Ethan's hand shot out, gripped her arm. Not hard, not restraining, just desperate. Grace, please. She looked up at him and whispered so only he could hear. Trust me, I am not running. But I cannot let you go to jail for me. Cannot let him destroy you. Trust me. Something in her eyes must have convinced him, because his hand slowly released her. The loss of his touch felt like losing gravity, but Grace forced herself to remain steady, to walk forward with her head high. Richard stepped aside, allowing Marshal Davis to place restraints on her wrists. The metal was cold, biting into skin. The marshal did it gently, apologetically, but it did not matter. She was being taken. The nightmare was happening again. As she passed Richard, he leaned close and whispered so only she could hear. Did you really think you could escape me? You are mine, Grace. You will always be mine. And when I get you back to Boston, you will learn what happens to wives who embarrass their husbands. She did not react, did not give him the satisfaction of her fear, just kept walking down the porch steps toward the horses waiting in the yard. Behind her, she heard Ethan's voice raw with anguish. I will come for you. Do you hear me, Grace? I will find a way. She did not turn around, could not let him see the tears streaming down her face, could not let him know how terrified she was. Had to be strong, had to play this through, had to trust that somewhere in all this darkness, there was still light to be found. They took her to the hotel in Mason Creek, where Richard had rented the finest room available. Marshal Davis stationed a deputy outside the door, more to prevent escape than to protect her privacy. When they were alone, Richard's mask finally fell away completely. He backhanded her across the face, the blow hard enough to split her lip. Grace tasted blood, felt the familiar sting, but did not cry out. Would not give him that. 4 months, Richard hissed, gripping her jaw hard enough to bruise. 4 months you made me look like a fool, made me search, made me spend money on detectives and travel. Do you know what people said? That I could not even keep my own wife in line. Grace met his eyes, and for the first time in their marriage, she did not look away, did not flinch. I am not your wife anymore. Whatever the law says, whatever those papers claim, I stopped being yours the moment I left. His eyes widened, shock and rage mixing. You think you have power now? You think that crippled cowboy gives you strength? I will destroy him. We'll ruin that ranch. We'll make sure everyone you care about suffers. Then you are exactly the monster I always knew you were. He raised his hand to strike her again, but stopped. A calculation passed across his features. Visible bruises would make his case harder, would give her allies ammunition. So instead he smiled. That terrible smile she knew so well. Get some rest, dear wife. Tomorrow we depart for Boston, and when we arrive, I will teach you lessons you will never forget. Slowly, carefully, no visible marks, just pain, just fear, just the absolute certainty that you will never ever escape me again. He left then, locking the door behind him. Grace sank onto the bed, her whole body shaking. The fear was enormous, crushing, threatening to drown her. But beneath it, burning like a coal, was rage. Pure, clean rage at the injustice of it all. At a world where men like Richard could use law and money to claim ownership of other human beings. She thought of Ethan, of his steady presence, his quiet strength. Thought of the children who had just found safety only to watch it ripped away. Thought of Owen trying so hard to atone for years of cowardice. Thought of the life she had begun to build, the person she had begun to become. And she made a decision. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever Richard planned, she would not go quietly, would not disappear into his Boston mansion to be slowly destroyed in private. If she had to face him, she would do it in the light, in front of witnesses, in a way that forced people to see exactly what he was. She did not know how yet, but she would find a way. At the ranch, Ethan paced like a caged animal, his injured legs screaming protest with every step. Cal and Owen sat at the table, papers spread between them, trying to find some legal argument, some loophole, some way to stop what was happening. Samuel appeared in the doorway, Lily and Benjamin behind him. The boy's face was set with determination beyond his years. "We want to help," Samuel said. Ethan stopped pacing, looked at the three children, saw their resolve, their willingness to fight for the woman who had given them home and hope. "I do not know how," Ethan admitted, the words like broken glass in his throat. "The law is on his side, the marshal has orders. And if I try to take her by force, I go to jail and she still ends up with him." "Then we do not fight with force," Samuel said. "We fight with truth. You said truth matters. You said people would listen if they knew what he really was. From the mouths of children, wisdom." Ethan looked at Cal, at Owen, saw the same realization dawning on their faces. "The town," Cal said slowly. "We bring it to the town. Make Richard face Grace in front of the whole community. Let people see him, hear the evidence, decide for themselves who deserves their support." "The marshal will not allow it," Owen said. "He has his orders." "Then we do not ask the marshal," Cal replied. "We go to the people directly. Pastor Weller can call a meeting. Town has a right to know what is happening in their midst. What kind of man they are, helping to reclaim his wife." Hope, fragile but real, flickered in the room. It was a desperate plan, relying on the goodness of people who did not know Grace, who had no reason to defy the law for a stranger. But it was something, a chance. They worked through the night. Owen organized his evidence. Cal rode to Pastor Weller's home despite the late hour, explained the situation. The pastor faced grave, agreed immediately to call a town meeting for the following morning. And Samuel, with his siblings' help, did something that would change everything. They drew pictures, simple childlike drawings of their time at the ranch. Grace teaching Lily to sew, Grace serving them meals, Grace tucking Benjamin into bed, Grace smiling, safe, happy. And Samuel wrote a letter in his careful, practiced hand, a letter that said simply, "Grace saved us, now we want to save her." Morning came gray and cold. Richard was preparing to depart, had already paid the hotel, had the coach ready. But when he came downstairs, he found the street outside filled with people. The entire town, or close to it, gathered in front of the church. Pastor Weller stood on the church steps, his voice carrying across the crowd. "People of Mason Creek, we are gathered here today to bear witness, to hear truth, to decide what kind of community we are." Richard's face went dark. He turned to Marshal Davis, who stood nearby looking deeply uncomfortable. "What is this? I have legal orders. This mob cannot interfere." "It is not a mob, Mr. Hartley," the marshal said quietly. "It is a town meeting. People have a right to gather to speak. I cannot stop that." "Then I will leave now. Take my wife and go." "You could do that," Pastor Weller called out, having heard the exchange. "Or you could stay. Face the people you are asking to condone your actions. Let them hear all sides before you take this woman away forever." It was a challenge Richard's ego could not resist. To leave would look like cowardice, like he had something to hide. So he stayed face set in lines of righteous indignation, playing the role of wounded husband to perfection. Grace was brought from the huddle, hands still bound. She climbed the church steps and for the first time stood facing the assembled town. Dozens of faces, some familiar, most not. Some sympathetic, many uncertain. A few hostile, convinced already by Mrs. Porter's whisper campaign that this was a woman of loose morals who deserved whatever fate befell her. But then Ethan was there, limping badly, leaning on a cane Cal had fashioned for him. He took his place beside Grace, not touching her, with her hands bound, but close enough that she could feel his presence like heat from a fire. And Pastor Weller began. The morning air was sharp enough to cut, but the crowd gathering before Mason Creek's modest church generated a warmth of human presence that defied the cold. Grace stood on the steps, her bound hands hidden in the folds of her skirt, and watched the town assemble to judge her fate. She recognized faces from her brief time in Mason Creek. Jeremiah Lynch, the storekeeper, stood with arms crossed, expressions skeptical. Women she had seen at church whispered behind gloved hands. Ranchers and cowboys, farmers, and their wives' children pulled from morning chores to witness something that would become town legend. And there in the front, her face a mask of stone, stood Adelaide Porter. Pastor Weller raised his hands for silence. The murmuring crowd quieted, breath misting in the cold air. Friends and neighbors, he began, voice carrying clear and strong. We gather not to defy the law, but to understand it, to see justice done, not merely legal procedure followed. Before us stands a woman accused by her husband of abandonment and theft. Behind those accusations lies a story, and every story deserves to be heard before judgment is rendered. Richard Hartley stepped forward, every inch, the respectable gentleman. Pastor, I appreciate your desire for fairness, but this is a private matter between husband and wife. I have legal documents signed by judges that require my wife's return. This spectacle is unnecessary. Is it? Pastor Weller's eyes were steady. When a man comes to our town to reclaim a woman who fled in terror, when that woman has found work and purpose here, when evidence suggests violence rather than simple marital discord, I would say public scrutiny is not only necessary but required. We are not Boston, Mr. Hartley. We are a community that looks after its own. She is not yours to look after, Richard said, voice sharpening. She is mine. The word hung in the cold air. Mine. Like cattle, like property, like something owned rather than someone loved. Cal Northridge stood then, his weathered face grave. Mr. Hartley, you speak of ownership, of legal rights. But I wonder if you would speak to us of character, of the duties a husband owes a wife, of protection rather than possession. Richard's smile was thin. I have protected my wife for 6 years, given her a fine home, servants, every comfort. She wanted for nothing. Except safety, Grace heard herself say. Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying further than she expected in the still morning. Except freedom from fear. All eyes turned to her. This was the moment, the precipice. She could stay silent, let others speak for her, maintain the fiction of proper womanhood that demanded women be seen and not heard, or she could speak her truth, claim her voice, risk everything on the chance that these strangers might hear her, and choose mercy over law. She chose voice. My name is Grace Hartley. 6 years ago, I married Richard Hartley in Boston. I was 22. My father had died, my mother was ill. Richard was older, established, respectable. I thought I was fortunate. She paused, gathering strength. The first time he hit me was 3 months after our wedding. I had laughed at another man's joke at a dinner party. Richard said I was flirting, making him look foolish. He struck me across the face, then wept and apologized. Promised it would never happen again. The crowd was utterly silent now. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. But it did happen again, and again, each time for smaller reasons. A meal not to his liking, a curtain hung incorrectly, walking too slowly, speaking too loudly, existing in ways that displeased him. Her voice remained steady, factual, laying out horror like arithmetic. He broke my arm once, told the doctor I had fallen downstairs. The doctor knew. I could see it in his eyes. But he said nothing because the law gave Richard that right. These are lies, Richard interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. Grace saw people looking at him differently now, seeing past the expensive clothes and cultured accent to something beneath. Are they? Owen Hartley stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. Brother, I watched you beat her. I heard her scream. I saw the bruises she tried to hide. And I said nothing because I was afraid of you. Afraid of your temper, your power, your ability to destroy anyone who crossed you. Richard's mask was cracking rage bleeding through. You are ill, Owen. Delusional. Everyone in Boston knows you suffer from weak nerves. Is that what you told them? Owen's laugh was bitter. That I was mad rather than simply guilty. That my grief at watching you destroy a good woman was mental illness rather than conscience. He turned to the crowd, pulling papers from his coat. I have medical records here, documenting Grace's injuries over 6 years. Fractures, contusions, burns. A pattern of trauma no clumsy woman could explain. He held up more papers. Letters from servants who witnessed the abuse. Testimony about a young man named Thomas who tried to intervene and died for it. And evidence of the money Richard paid to make that death disappear. Marshall Davis stepped forward, took the papers, began to read. His face grew darker with each page. These are fabrications, Richard said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. My brother has always been jealous of my success. This is revenge, nothing more. Then explain the scars. The voice came from the crowd. An older woman pushed forward, her face lined with years and hard living. She was a ranch wife, hands rough from work, eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. I saw them. Last week at church when she reached for the hymnal, her sleeve rode up. Scars on her wrists like she had been bound. Scars that were old, healed over. What marriage causes scars like that, Mr. Hartley? Other voices rose. A man who had seen Grace flinch when Jeremiah Lynch had slammed his hand on the counter. A woman who had noticed how Grace never quite relaxed, even in church, always watching, always ready to flee. Small observations, each one a thread. Together they wove a picture that was damning. Richard's composure was fracturing. You do not understand. Marriage is difficult. Women need firm guidance. Grace could be willful disobedient. I was merely correcting. Correcting, Ethan's voice cut through the murmurs. He stepped forward, his injured leg making his progress slow but inexorable. You beat a woman half your size and call it correction. You broke bones and call it guidance. You are not a husband. Mr. Hartley, you are a tyrant who used law and money to torture someone who trusted you. Richard's face twisted. And what are you, cripple, a failed rancher playing hero for a woman who spread her legs for you the moment she arrived? Do not think your motives are pure. You want her as much as I do. The difference is I have legal claim. The crude words were designed to shock, to make Grace seem like a whore, to turn sympathy into judgment. But they had the opposite effect. The crowd saw Richard's mask fall completely, saw the ugliness beneath, and recoiled. Before anyone could respond, a small voice spoke. That is not true. Samuel Tucker stood at the base of the church steps, his siblings beside him. He held papers in his hand, the drawings they had made, the letter he had written. His young face was set with a determination that made him seem older than his 9 years. Grace is good, Samuel said clearly. She gave us food when we were hungry, gave us a home when no one wanted us. She teaches Lily to sew, and Benjamin his letters, and me to read better. She does not ask for anything back. She just gives because that is who she is. He held up the drawings. Simple crayon pictures of a woman smiling, of children, laughing, of safety and warmth. This is the woman you want to send back to him. This is the person you think deserves to be hurt. Lily stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. She makes me not scared anymore. Please do not let the bad man take her. Something shifted in the crowd. These were not abstract arguments about marriage law and wifely duties. These were children, innocent and honest, speaking from experience. And their words carried a weight that legal documents could not match. Then Adelaide Porter moved. The crowd parted for her, this woman who had been Grace's harshest critic, who had spread rumors and demanded her removal from town. She climbed the steps slowly, her face a landscape of conflict and pain. When she spoke, her voice shook but held. I need to say something. Something I should have said years ago. She turned to face the assembled town, these people she had lived among for 40 years. My husband, Samuel Porter, was a respected man in this community. Devout, hardworking. When he died 5 years ago, Many of you mourned him as a pillar of our town." She paused, breathing deep. "He was also a man who beat me for 30 years, who broke my ribs, blackened my eyes, made me live in terror every day of our marriage. And I never told anyone, never sought help, never left, because I was taught that marriage was sacred, that wives submitted to husbands, that suffering in silence was virtue." The crowd's stunned silence was absolute. No one had known. No one had suspected. "When Grace Hartley came to this town, I hated her." Adelaide continued, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I hated her because she did what I never had the courage to do. She ran. She chose herself over her vows. And that made me look at my own life and see it for what it was. Cowardice dressed as duty." She turned to Grace, this woman she had tried to destroy. "I sent the telegram that brought your husband here. I thought I was upholding morality, but I was really trying to punish you for being braver than me. And for that I am deeply, profoundly sorry." The apology hung in the air, raw and painful. Grace felt tears on her own cheeks, not of sadness, but of recognition. How many women stood in this crowd who knew exactly what Adelaide described? How many had lived with fear, justified it as normal, convinced themselves they deserved it? "I was wrong," Adelaide said, voice strengthening. "And if this town sends Grace back to that man after hearing what we have heard, seeing what we have seen, then we are all complicit in what happens to her. We become the people who chose law over mercy, propriety, over protection. And I will not be that person again." She looked directly at Richard Hartley. "You may have the law on your side, sir, but you do not have decency, you do not have honor, and you do not have this town's approval." Richard's face had gone from red to white to purple. His hands were fists, his whole body vibrating with barely controlled rage. "This is insanity. You are all mad. The law is clear. She is my wife. She returns with me, or the marshal arrests anyone who interferes." Marshal Davis had been reading through Owen's evidence, his face growing graver with each page. Now he looked up, his weathered features troubled. "Mr. Hartley, these documents suggest serious crimes. Assault, possible murder. If even half of what is alleged here is true, you should be answering to a court yourself. Those are fabrications by a mentally unstable brother and a lying wife." Richard spat, but his polished facade was gone completely, now revealing the ugly truth beneath. "Perhaps," the marshal said slowly, "but they deserve investigation. And I am not inclined to hand a woman over to a man accused of such things without further inquiry." "You have no authority to delay," Richard shouted. "I have court orders." "From Boston courts," Marshal Davis replied, "but we are in Wyoming territory, and I have some discretion in how I enforce warrants from other jurisdictions, especially when new evidence comes to light." It was not a refusal, but it was hesitation, a crack in the wall of law that had seemed so absolute. Richard saw he was losing control of the narrative. His hands went to his coat, and Grace saw with horror what he was reaching for. A gun. Small, easily concealed, but deadly at close range. "Enough," Richard snarled, pulling the weapon free. "She is mine, given to me by God and law, and I will not let a town of ignorant peasants interfere." He pointed the gun at Grace, and time seemed to slow. Grace saw Ethan move, saw him launch himself forward despite his injured leg, saw Owen reaching for his brother, saw the marshal's hand going to his own weapon. But it was Samuel who acted fastest. The boy threw himself between Grace and Richard, small body interposing itself as a shield, arms spread wide. "No," Samuel shouted. "You want to hurt her? You go through me." For a moment, Richard stood frozen, gun pointed at a 9-year-old child, the entire town watching. The tableau held everyone afraid to breathe, afraid that any movement would trigger catastrophe. Then Lily and Benjamin moved to stand with their brother, forming a wall of children between Grace and the gun. And behind them came others. Ethan, despite his injury. Owen facing his brother with tears streaming down his face. Adelaide Porter, this woman who had chosen courage over comfort. Cal Northridge. Pastor Weller. One by one, people stepped forward. Not all. Some remained back uncertain, afraid. But enough. Enough to form a human barrier, to say with their bodies that violence would not stand unopposed. Richard's hand trembled. The gun wavered. He was surrounded by witnesses, by people who had heard his own words condemn him, who had seen his mask fall away. If he fired, there would be no talking his way out. No money could buy this many witnesses to stay silent. "Brother," Owen said softly, "please, it is over. Let her go." Richard's face contorted with rage and something else. Pain, perhaps. The agony of a man who defined himself by control, watching that control slip away. "She is mine," he whispered. "Without her, without ownership, what am I?" "You are a man who needs help," Owen said, "who has been poisoned by power for so long, he has forgotten how to be human. But it does not have to end like this. Put down the gun, let the law handle this properly." For a long, terrible moment, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Richard's arms slowly lowered. The gun dropped from his fingers into the snow, and he collapsed, shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded like something breaking. Marshal Davis moved quickly, retrieving the weapon, signaling his deputies to restrain Richard. "Richard Hartley, you are under arrest for threatening violence, for assault, and pending investigation for the crimes detailed in these documents. You have the right to answer these charges in court." As the deputies led Richard away, he looked back at Grace one final time. The hate in his eyes was pure and absolute, but there was also defeat. He had lost. Not just Grace, but his own sense of invincibility. And that loss was written in every line of his face. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring, processing what they had witnessed. But many came to Grace first, touched her shoulder, offered quiet words of support. Adelaide Porter took Grace's hands, the restraints finally removed, and held them gently. "You are braver than I ever was," Adelaide said, "and you will always have a friend in me." Grace could not speak past the emotion clogging her throat, could only nod, only grip Adelaide's hands in return. Ethan was there, then his presence solid and real. He did not embrace her publicly, did not cross propriety's lines. But his eyes said everything his words could not. "Safe now. You are safe." But as the crowd continued to disperse, as people returned to their homes and daily lives, Grace felt the weight of what came next. Richard was arrested, true, but he was not convicted. The legal battle was only beginning. And the necklace, that cursed sapphire that hung around her neck, was still technically stolen property until a court ruled otherwise. She was free for now, but the word "now" contained all her fear. How long would freedom last? What would happen when Richard's money bought lawyers, when Boston courts demanded her return, when the law reasserted itself over community sentiment? These questions followed her back to the ranch, where Cal had a fire roaring and soup warming, where the children clustered around her, needing reassurance that she would not be taken, where Owen sat quietly processing the fact that he had betrayed his only family to do what was right, and where Ethan waited, his eyes asking a question he did not voice. What now? Grace did not have an answer yet, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not run again. Whatever came, whoever tried to claim her, she would face it here with these people in this place that had become more home in weeks than Boston ever was in years. The battle was not over. But for the first time, Grace believed she might actually win. Winter loosened its grip, slowly, reluctantly, like a miser parting with gold. The days after Richard's arrest were a strange suspension of time, where Grace lived in the space between fear and hope, not quite believing either was permanent. Richard sat in the Mason Creek jail awaiting trial. He had money for lawyers, for telegrams east, for every legal maneuver available to a wealthy man accused of crimes against a wife. But he did not have freedom. And for Grace, that fact alone was revolutionary. Owen stayed at the ranch, his face marked by the complexity of having saved a woman by destroying his brother. He worked harder than anyone asked, as if physical labor could atone for years of silent complicity. Grace watched him with the children, saw how gently he spoke to them, and understood that redemption was a daily choice, not a single moment. Marshal Davis, after reviewing Owen's evidence thoroughly, sent telegrams to Boston authorities. Inquiries began about Thomas's death, about the bribes Richard had paid, about patterns of behavior that suggested calculated violence rather than isolated incidents. The law, Grace learned, moved slowly, but it did move. 6 weeks after the confrontation, a lawyer arrived from Cheyenne. Not one of Richard's, but one hired by Cal Northridge, using his considerable influence and money. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Wright, who had made her career defending the defenseless, had news. "Mrs. Hartley," she said, sitting in the ranch's parlor with papers spread before her, "I have filed a petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty and abandonment of marital duties. Wyoming Territory has more progressive laws regarding women's rights than Massachusetts. We have a strong case. Grace's hands trembled in her lap. How long? 6 months minimum. Possibly longer if Mr. Hartley's lawyers contest, which they will. But the evidence is compelling. Medical records, witness testimonies, the attempted assault in front of the entire town, and Boston authorities are now investigating the death of the young man Thomas. If those charges proceed, they undermine any claim Mr. Hartley has to moral authority. 6 months, half a year of waiting, of not quite being free, of existing in legal limbo. But it was a path forward, a real one. And the necklace, Grace asked. Catherine smiled. Gift between spouses during marriage, not theft. We have that argument ready. Mr. Hartley will not be able to use it to force your return. Small victories, small movements toward freedom. Grace clung to them like lifelines. That night after supper, when the children were in bed and Cal had retired to his room, Grace found herself alone with Ethan on the porch. The evening was cold, but not brutal spring, beginning its slow infiltration of winter's territory. Stars blazed overhead, indifferent and beautiful. 6 months, Ethan said quietly. Yes. And then Grace turned to look at him. This man who had stood between her and violence without hesitation, who had offered her work when she was desperate, safety, when she was hunted, belief, when she had none left for herself. And then I am free, she said, legally, finally free. And what will you do with freedom? It was not a demand, not an assumption of claim, just a question offered with the same gentle respect he had shown from the beginning. Grace's throat tightened with emotion. I do not know, she admitted. For so long, freedom was just abstract concept, impossible dream. Now that it might actually happen, I do not know what shape it takes. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, vulnerable. I do not know how to say this properly, but I need you to know. These past weeks with you here, with the children, with purpose, beyond just going through motions, it has reminded me what living feels like. Not just surviving, but actually living. Grace waited, letting him find his words. I love Sarah, Ethan continued. Will always love her. And Daniel. They were my family, my world. When they died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. That I would just work until I wore out, then follow them into the ground. He turned to face her fully. But you changed that. Not by trying to replace them, but by showing me that a heart can hold multiple loves. That grief and new joy can exist together. That choosing to care again is not betrayal of what was lost. Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. I am not asking for promises, Ethan said. I know you need time, need to discover who you are outside of fear, outside of being someone's possession. But I want you to know, when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I would be honored to stand beside you. Not as owner, not as master, but as partner, as someone who chooses you every day because you choose him back. It was the most words Grace had ever heard him speak at once, and every one of them landed like a promise, like a gift, freely given, without demand for return. I do not know how to do this, Grace whispered. How to trust this. Richard told me I was worthless, that no one would want me, that I was damaged beyond repair. And sometimes I believe him. Sometimes I think I am too broken to be loved properly. Ethan reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, giving her time to refuse. When she did not, his hand cupped her face with such gentleness that it made her heart ache. You are not broken. You are a person who survived, and survival takes the kind of strength most people never have to discover. You are the strongest person I know, Grace Hartley, and worth loving is not something given by someone else's opinion. It just is. Grace leaned into his touch, let herself feel safe in it, feel cherished. Then she stood on her toes and kissed him. Soft, tentative testing. He responded with equal gentleness, not demanding more, just accepting what was offered. When they parted, both were smiling. 6 months, Grace said. Ask me again in 6 months, when I am legally free, when I know who I am outside of being someone's wife, and I will give you an answer. I can wait 6 months, Ethan said. I can wait forever if that is what you need. But Grace knew she would not make him wait forever. She had already made her choice in her heart, if not yet in law. This man, this place, these children who had become family. This was home. This was where she would build her life. The weeks turned to months. Spring arrived in earnest melting snow, revealing earth hungry for seeds. Grace planted a garden behind the house, teaching Lily the names of vegetables, showing Benjamin how to tell weeds from wanted plants. Samuel learned to ride properly, took pride in working alongside Cal and Ethan with the cattle. Adelaide Porter became a frequent visitor, bringing fabric for new dresses, offering friendship that grew deeper with each conversation. Together, they began quietly helping other women in town, those whose husbands were too free with fists, too quick with harsh words, creating a network of support, of places to stay, of resources for those who needed to leave. Richard remained in jail, his lawyers fighting the extradition to Boston where murder charges awaited. His money bought delays, but not freedom. And with each passing week, his power diminished while Grace's grew. In May, the divorce was granted. 6 months, almost to the day after Grace had arrived in Mason Creek, she stood in a courtroom and heard a judge declare her marriage dissolved. Richard Hartley had no further legal claim. The necklace was declared her property. She was free. She walked out of that courtroom into sunshine, Ethan beside her, and felt lighter than she had in years. The weight she had carried so long, the chains of law and fear, and Richard's voice in her head, telling her she was nothing, all of it fell away. That evening, Ethan asked the question she had been waiting for. They stood by the garden she had planted, now green with growing things. The children were inside, helping Cal with supper. The world was soft with spring evening light. Grace Hartley, Ethan said, taking her hand on. You are free now, free to go anywhere, be anyone, choose any life you want. And I know I have no right to ask this, no claim to make, but I have to say it. I have to let you know what is in my heart. He knelt slowly because his legs still pained him sometimes, and looked up at her with eyes that held everything he felt. Will you marry me not because law demands it or society expects it, not because you need protection or I need a cook, but because I love you, because you have made me believe in futures again, because I want to spend every day choosing you and having you choose me back. Grace looked down at this good man, this person who had given her everything without asking anything in return. Thought about the girl she had been terrified and small convinced she deserved pain. Thought about the woman she had become who had crossed a continent and faced down demons and learned her own worth. Yes, she said, pulling him to his feet, laughing and crying at once. Yes, I will marry you because I love you, because you taught me what love actually looks like, because choosing you feels like choosing myself. They married in June in Pastor Weller's church with the whole town attending. Even those who had been skeptical, who had doubted, came to witness. Because Grace's story had changed something in Mason Creek, had made people look at their own lives differently, had reminded them that law and justice were not always the same thing. Adelaide Porter stood as Grace's matron of honor, this woman who had become sister in all but blood. The children served as attendants, Lily scattering flowers, Benjamin carrying rings, Samuel standing proud in his first suit. Owen walked Grace down the aisle, this act of giving away meaning, something different than traditional. Not transfer of property, but acknowledgement of choice. When Pastor Weller asked who gave this woman Owen's voice, was clear, she gives herself, as she should always have been allowed to do. Ethan's vows were simple, spoken in his quiet voice, but heard by everyone. I promise to stand beside you, not above you, to protect you without possessing you, to love you not despite your strength, but because of it, to choose you every morning and come home to you every night, until death and beyond. Grace's vows came from deeper place, from scars and survival and hard-won wisdom. I promise to trust you with my truth, to build with you rather than hide from you, to remember that love is not chains but wings, to choose courage over fear, partnership over submission, us over me, for all my days. When they kissed, the church erupted in applause, and Grace felt something shift inside her, final and complete. She was not Grace Hartley anymore, wife to Richard. She was Grace Caldwell, partner to Ethan. But more than that, she was simply Grace, whole, free, her own person. The celebration lasted into the evening, food and music and joy. Grace danced with her new husband, with Cal, who had tears in his eyes, with each of the children who had become hers. She saw Adelaide dancing with a widower from town, saw the possibility of new beginnings reflected there. And in a corner, she saw Owen sitting alone watching the celebration with bittersweet expression. She went to him, this man who had sacrificed everything to save her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for choosing right over easy, for being brave when it mattered most." Owen smiled, sad but genuine. "I only wish I had done it sooner, before you suffered so much. You did it when you could. That is what matters." Grace squeezed his hand. "What will you do now?" "Stay here if Cal will have me. Build a life that is not defined by my brother's shadow. Try to be the man I should have been all along." "You are that man now," Grace said. "The rest is just practice." As night fell and stars emerged, Grace and Ethan slipped away from the celebration to the ranch, to the home they would share. They stood together on the porch, looking out at land that stretched to horizons they would never reach, under sky so vast it made human concerns seem small and manageable. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked. Grace thought about the question, about the long road that had brought her here, the pain and fear and desperate flight, about the woman she had been and the woman she had become, about the fact that happiness, real happiness, was something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. "I am happy. I am home." They went inside together, to the house filled with children's laughter and the smells of supper and all the ordinary miracles of daily life. To the future they would build, one choice at a time and one day at a time together. And far away in a Boston cell, Richard Hartley faced trial for murder, for assault, for all the cruelties that money had once hidden but could no longer protect. His empire crumbled. His name became synonymous not with respect but with warning. And Grace, living her life in Wyoming sunshine, did not spare him a single thought. She had won, not through violence or revenge, but through survival, through community, through the simple, revolutionary act of believing she deserved better. And she had found it. In work, in children who called her mother, in a man who loved her without needing to own her, in a town that had chosen mercy over law, in her own heart, finally free to beat without fear. The winter that had brought her to Mason Creek had been brutal, had nearly killed her. But it had also delivered her to this moment, this life, this joy. And Grace, who had learned that survival was its own form of strength, knew that she would carry both the scars and the triumphs forward, not as badges of victimhood, but as evidence of resilience, of the human capacity to endure, to change, to grow beyond trauma into something beautiful. She was free. She was loved. She was home. And winter, when it came again, would find her ready, surrounded by family, wrapped in warmth, no longer alone against the cold. Never alone again. The end.